Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. We are live. My name is Stolyarov II, and today we have a very special guest, Kyrel Zantonavitch, who is the author of Pure Liberal Fire, Brief Essays on the New, General, and Perfected Philosophy of Western Liberalism. He is also the founder of the Liberal Institute, where he publishes both brief and in-depth philosophical commentary and commentary on current events. I've been following his website for more than a decade now, and I would like to introduce Mr. Zantonavitch by reading an excerpt from my review of Pure Liberal Fire.
Okay.
There is perhaps not a single thinker in the world more fearless than Kyrel Zantonavitch. Pure Liberal Fire is the direct provocative distillation of his thoughts on metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, economics, culture, religion, and the history of philosophy, including Objectivism and classical liberalism. Zantonavitch seeks to evoke a pure, true liberalism, and he shows no mercy for ideologies and attitudes that constitute its antithesis. He certainly leaves no doubt in the reader's mind about where he stands on the issues addressed, and each article within the book employs an abundance of superlative expressions, be they positive or negative, and when Zantonavitch praises, he really praises, and the same goes for when he condemns. I give this book a rating of 5 stars because it invariably makes people think, no matter who they are or what their starting persuasions and assumptions might be. And with that, welcome, Kyrel. I intend to ask you quite a few questions about your thoughts, your general philosophical framework, and what I'd like to start out with is perhaps the broadest question of all. You have originated a new system of thought, but it is also a system of thought that takes a lot of elements from classical liberalism, objectivism, libertarianism, and Austrian economics. Certainly your system and those frameworks of thought have a lot in common. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the most prominent distinguishing features of your system of thought that set it apart from all of those?
Okay, well, that's a good way to start off, and thank you for having me on your Google Hangout, and I'm also impressed that you were able to pronounce my name, which is not easy, Kyrel Zantonavitch, although you're a person who also has a difficult name to pronounce.
Indeed.
I was most complimented in your review of my book when you said that I was maybe like the most fiery thinker on the planet. This is actually my goal, more or less. My intent is more or less to be the strongest liberal thinker in existence, to learn as much as I can. I'm really focused on just this one concept. And liberalism, in my opinion, is a philosophy and a resultant culture which emerged 2,600 years ago with the Greeks. I would rework maybe everything philosophically and culturally, starting with the Greeks. For example, people say that the Greeks invented science and philosophy. I would say, well, no, maybe they just invented one thing, which is reason. And so you apply reason to the natural world, and that's science, and you apply reason to the human world, or else the intellectual world, and that's philosophy. So I guess I should define liberalism very quickly and say that this is quietly the philosophy of the best of the West for 2,600 years. It means the epistemology of reason, the ethics of individualism, the politics of freedom, and the best and most liberal periods of society were the Greek period, the Roman period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. And right now we have 3 radical avant-garde groups which are also liberal, and they are the Austrian economic thinkers, the libertarian political thinkers, and the objectivist philosophical thinkers. And I try and learn as much as I can from all 7 groups, and I try and be wiser and better and more insightful than all of them.
So it seems to me that the key distinguishing feature of your thought is it attempts to be a pure distillation of this liberal strain of thinking that has been with Western culture for 2,600 years, but over that time frame, of course, Western history has been mixed. It has had other strains in it as well, a very prominent influence, say, of Christianity since really the 1st century CE, but most prominently from about 400 CE to about 1700 CE, and that influence sometimes ran counter to the liberal strain, sometimes borrowed from it, as Thomas Aquinas did, for instance. But it seems to me what you're trying to do is take this one liberal strain that had certain manifestations during the Greco-Roman era, during the Renaissance, during the Enlightenment, and during our time, particularly with the information revolution, with the biotechnology revolution that is accelerating now, and try to offer a kind of undiluted, very intense version of it. Would you say that's a fair characterization?
Well, that's a pretty fair characterization. One way to look at pure liberalism is just to think of it as a very simple philosophy. In certain respects, it's not even a philosophy. It's just a category of philosophy or a type of philosophy. The thing that I think I've discovered is that there's much more similarity between these 7 groups: the Greeks, the Romans, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and these 3 current cutting-edge groups. There's far more similarity than people realize. And I also think that, in essence, Western society has moved toward one belief quietly, without quite realizing it, and that is to the realization that reason is a kind of definitive concept in epistemology, and individualism is a definitive concept in ethics, and freedom is a definitive concept in politics. And these words are similar to health, or life, or pleasure, or happiness. And if you think about it, there's no place you can go further than health, or life, or pleasure, or happiness. Once you've achieved that, once you've achieved 100% of that, then that's everything. Now, when it comes to discussing things like reason, rationality, logic, and science, you could say that God is in the details. And so people need to study over which is the best form of epistemology, which is rational. You know, whether it's Aristotle, or Epicurus, or Zeno the Stoic, or John Locke, Adam Smith, or whether it's Friedrich Hayek or Ayn Rand. And of course, you have to study over the details of which is the best form of individualism and which is the best form of the politics of liberty, justice, and individual rights. But the thing that that drives me on a personal level and philosophical level is that I think there's a massive continuity which the objectivist movement has not understood. So we've got this very leading edge philosophical group known as the Objectivists, but they're slightly ahistorical, and maybe even they're slightly aphilosophical, and they don't understand how much they fit into the context of Western liberalism. So I try and, in my book, I'm brave enough to say that I'm presenting people with the perfected version of Western liberalism. So I really think that I'm doing that, and so I analyze all the current issues and all the historical issues from this one perspective, which I call pure liberalism, or else a simple version of updated classical liberalism.
Indeed, and I pretty much agree with everything you've just said. Certainly the role of reason, the role of individualism in essentially facilitating human progress has been tremendous, and those eras where those strains have been the most powerful have also seen the most massive progress. Clearly the reason that flourished during the Enlightenment catalyzed the Industrial Revolution, which led to massive increases in standards of living, whereby every single one of us in the Western world right now enjoys more amenities, longer life expectancies, and a far higher quality of life than even the kings of the pre-modern era did. I also am very intrigued, and have been for a number of years, with regard to your comments about objectivism. In Pure Liberal Fire, you simultaneously...
I have many comments about objectivism, and I'm an extreme critic, so much that they probably hate me in general. But yes, I have all kinds of comments and criticisms, and I welcome any challenge whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Now, in Pure Liberal Fire, you have what I would consider a dialectic characterization of objectivism. On the one hand, you do consider it one of the most cutting-edge philosophical strains. On the other hand, you explicitly characterize a lot of objectivists today as being cult-like and dogmatic and perhaps
Yes.
unreceptive to intellectual progress. And I
Yes.
was curious, what do you think leads to this very strange combination of characteristics? One would think that people who are more enlightened, more cutting edge, more devoted to reason would be less dogmatic, more inclined to innovate philosophically, but I do share some of your empirical observations as well.
Well, that's also the fault of the non-historical nature of current objectivist thinking, because any person, if they were really well acquainted with philosophy, would realize that religion and cultism has been there since the beginning. We had these great, more or less great group of thinkers, like 50 years after philosophy was invented by Thales and those Miletians. These people known as Pythagoreans, and they created the world's first religion or cult. And I even think that a truly great man, which came after Aristotle by the name of Epicurus, his group of thinkers and people that lived in their private communities, isolated from the rest of Greece, they died out because they lived in a kind of a cult. So religion and cultism is very common. And you say, well, where did this religiosity come from? In the case of objectivism, this philosophy of radical individualism and reason and independent thought, supposedly. Well, it came, unfortunately, from Ayn Rand herself. I think that what happens is that in a very normal and human manner, she simply was fighting the whole world, and in a kind of a natural way, she just sort of retreated into herself and her group. And after a while, if you would disagree with her or ask too many questions, she would consider you to be disloyal personally and intellectually, even though you weren't. And so the legacy of Ayn Rand is basically two groups of people. One is the rational philosophical group, and one is the religious cult group. And the cult group, of course, is led by the Ayn Rand Institute, and the rational philosophical group is led very poorly, perhaps, by the Atlas Society, but also by independent thinkers such as yourself.
Well, thank you very much for characterizing me as one of the leaders of the rational and philosophical group. I certainly strive to live up. I certainly strive to live up to that designation, and I do have great respect for the Atlas Society as well. By the way, I've read their articles for a number of years, and I consider them to, let's say, take a much more analytical, a much more inquisitive approach than the Ayn Rand Institute's articles do. It seems to me the Ayn Rand Institute is, at least historically, has been more concerned with towing the party line, so to speak, that the later Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff after her established, and not really tolerating any deviations. I think the worst instance of that was Peter Schwartz's article in the 1980s called Libertarianism, the Perversion of Liberty, because
yes, 1989.
Yes, while thinkers like us see a lot of commonality between libertarianism and objectivism, and indeed I would consider myself to be very much a libertarian because I agree with many of the underlying premises that most libertarians hold. And we seek common ground, we seek integration, we seek to develop something that even spreads beyond what these thought systems historically encompassed. It would certainly seem to be very limiting and to a certain extent very sad to just say, okay, this is what Ayn Rand wrote, it is the truth, it is the whole truth, and if we take anything materially beyond that, other than just applying it to particular instances or particular situations, that somehow becomes a heresy. I'm very averse to that way of thinking, and I expect you would be as well.
Yes, well, you said all kinds of things which are thoughtful and intelligent and worthwhile, and that's why I sort of think people should read my book, because I must have addressed about 5 or 6 of your questions in my book. I can say several things in response, and hopefully I'm not pontificating too much, even though I think I seem to be guilty of that. I think I think the Atlas Society is weak in the sense that it doesn't have enough fire and energy. And you might say, well, why are they like that? Well, because they want to establish themselves as a non-religious and non-cult group. They're similar to the Germans after 1945. All of their political thinkers were very subdued in public. They wanted to show they're not like Hitler. One of the radical things one of the claims which I make in my book, Pure Liberal Fire, which I hear unanswered, no one agrees and no one disagrees, is I think that in many respects all the evil in the world or all the failure can be categorized in 2 ways, which is right wing and left wing. So if you start at the beginning, the failure of epistemology, the failure to adhere to reason and rationality in epistemology can be found in right-wing faith or dogma, or else left-wing relativism and subjectivism. I would claim that truth is objective and absolute. So this is a very quick statement, but it needs to be debated in some detail. And I would say the failure of the right wing and the left wing in ethics is the right wing more or less believes in God and says you should serve God. The left wing believes in collectivism and says you should serve the collective. And so I say, as a pure liberal, you should believe in the individual and yourself and your own life and your own happiness. And you should serve yourself 100%. You should serve God 0 in essence, and the collective 0 in essence. I don't know if you have an opinion that, Gennady, that it really is possible to divide all intellectual failure into the right wing and the left wing, but that's one of these strange and radical claims which I make.
Well, I definitely think those two package deals, to use a term from Ayn Rand, are
Yes.
very prevalent today, and very unfortunately so. It seems to me a lot of them arose as a historical accident, for instance, of where various political parties in Western Europe and the United States have been aligned since about the time of the French Revolution, but you have this conservative, so-called right-wing strain that places a lot of value on tradition, on religion, on social order of a very kind of militaristic, authoritarian kind, and then you have the so-called left-wing strain, the socialist, redistributionist, moral and cultural relativist strain. Ironically, it seems to me they both feed into one another until there comes a point where it's a distinction without a difference. And you have
Well, they're both
today,
irrational and illiberal, to use my terms. They're both irrational and illiberal, but it's sort of similar to Aristotle's concept of the golden mean, wherein perfection is somehow in the middle. So you want to be a brave person, but if you're too brave, then you're foolhardy. If you're not brave enough, then you're a coward. So you sort of aim for the middle. And so my claim that everyone should be an up-wing liberal and not a right-winger or a left-winger is that if you go to the right or to the left, you're making a mistake. You should always I mean, I invent these words called up-wing liberalism, and my friends actually criticize me, and they sometimes say, well, you're inventing words, but you're not inventing new concepts. And my belief is that no, I think I'm inventing new concepts. At some point, the battle for words is the battle for the fate of the entire planet, and so you need to get the words right.
actually, with regard to the word upwing, there is one other context in which I encountered it, and that is in the
Really?
thought of FM 2030, who was an early transhumanist thinker. He was intellectually active from the 1960s to the 1990s, and
I've
then
heard of him.
he died in the year 2000. He was cryonically preserved, but he was one of the people who really advanced the early concepts of transhumanism and tried to popularize the idea of radical life extension and also the idea of human enhancement. And I actually think, given this upwing characterization that both you and he have employed for your ideas, this is a good bridge into transhumanism.
Yes.
Transhumanism is essentially the idea that human beings can overcome age-old limitations that have historically been considered inextricable parts of human nature, but through science, technology, through essentially the application of reason in a very advanced and refined and sophisticated state, these limitations can be lifted, including limitations on the human lifespan or various physical and mental limitations that we currently experience. So
I think that's wonderful. I think that I agree with transhumanism. I think it's a normal part of liberalism. I would say it's possible that you've. I thank you for being good enough as a human being to take it very seriously. I've always been a transhumanist, but I didn't really know it, and I didn't really take it seriously. The fact that you wrote a great book about it for children, but also, in my opinion, for adults, that helps. And so I think it's part of the ascent of man, which is what I believe in. I can see that these questions are this discussion is much more rich than I realize, and so we're not going to be able to get it done in 1 hour. But it's possible just to skip over very lightly and hopefully respectfully that you may have missed one other thing, which is that another part of the ascent of man right now is to make some sort of attempt to contact with space aliens, which I think probably exist. I have zero evidence for that, but it seems like it's a similar concept to transhumanism. I wonder if I can take one quick step back, and then I will try and follow along with you in the questions that you ask. Can I do that, please?
Sure.
Okay, this is my relationship to objectivism. I think it's the most liberal philosophy that has ever come along. I think that it's wonderfully in favor of the epistemology of reason, rationality, logic, and science. It's wonderfully in favor of the ethics of individualism, personal happiness, and individual. And it's wonderfully in favor of the politics of liberty, justice, and individual rights. But I think it should be seen in the context of the ascent of man and Western liberalism. I think that Ayn Rand learned a great deal from the Austrian economic thinkers such as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. She doesn't really acknowledge that. That's her sort of opposition to history and the history of philosophy and the history of man. And many people have continued with that, which is a small but important mistake. But I think we should continue to rise above objectivism if it's possible. Now, if she's right, then she's right about everything, but she'd also be the first person in the history of humankind to achieve perfection. I think that
Indeed.
life will go on forever, and we will improve philosophy. So I'm not really an enemy of objectivism. I love objectivism. But at the same time, I abandoned it as a public thinker and intellectual for 18 years because of the icy cold and I thought even evil nature of the people that were leading the objectivist world. And so I was very happy when David Kelly in 1989 created a rational version of the philosophy. Unfortunately for me, I had no realization of that for 10 years. So I really missed out, and that's like a devastatingly bad thing which happened to me in my personal life. It could have changed my entire life. So I sort of came to become a pure liberal on my own. I wasn't helped out by David Kelly. I think that's the main thing I wanted to say. I probably wanted to say something else, but oh well, I got at least half of it said.
Well, I'll follow up on that a bit with regard to how I would characterize myself. Since about 2008, when I've been asked, well, are you an objectivist? My answer has been, I'm an objectivist in the broad sense, but not in the narrow sense. In the broad sense, in that I agree with pretty much all of Ayn Rand's fundamental premises, but not in the narrow sense, in that I don't necessarily believe she was correct about all the conclusions she drew from those premises, or about all of the specific issues to which she applied her conclusions. And I think it would probably take too long for me to go through each one of those issues, but fundamentally what I see her as doing is essentially distilled in a similar way to what you're trying to do, some of the fundamental conceptual elements that have animated the Western intellectual tradition for a very long time. And she developed a concise, very logical way of articulating those elements that is very appealing, especially for people who are beginning to delve into philosophy. That's why Ayn Rand is so appealing to a lot of intellectual young people, for instance. They can get a very intense, focused, structured view of rational philosophy from her. But at the same time, the more I have read of other historical thinkers, the more amazing parallels and similarities I see to important aspects of Ayn Rand's thought.
And I also think that if you read through all the great liberal thinkers from the Greeks to up to today, and you see it in the light of objectivism as influenced by objectivism, you'll find that these people have more wisdom and truth than it would seem, or than the conventional objectivist movement would indicate. And I also think it's worth noting that the Enlightenment liberals of the 1700s, such as in England, Scotland, France, the Netherlands, America, and Canada, they actually lived liberalism, at least if you're white and male and middle class, or or upper class. So it's better to live a liberal lifestyle than to just sort of create it in your head. I can think of two more quick things which perhaps I forgot to say, which is I actually do dispute you and many other people who are very polite. I'm not as polite, so I'm more liberated than you, Gennady. I can say things you can't. And not only am I not as polite to my enemies, I don't even have a desire to be polite. So I would say that yourself and others are mistaken in retreating from the term objectivism. I consider myself to be a full objectivist. I think people associated with the Ayn Rand Institute, such as Leonard Peikoff, Peter Schwartz, Harry Binswanger, these are pseudo-objectivists. These people are enemies of Ayn Rand. They're enemies of the philosophy of objectivism. They're cultists. They practice two massive evils which come from religion, which is they excommunicate you if you ask too many questions, and they censor you. And I've had an unending series of experiences with these guys, including even a very good writer by the name of Don Watkins about 3 months ago, and also with Yaron Brook about a couple weeks ago. And they always give me a bad experience. They cannot stand up to me. I detest them personally, and I wish them harm personally, and that doesn't make me a bad person, in my opinion. That makes me a good person.
Wow.
Just to let you know something about Yaron Brook, he's unaware of transhumanism as a phenomenon. He hasn't read the book. He doesn't know about Zoltan Istvan, or he's never even heard of the transhumanist wager. And every time I try and have some sort of normal discussion with these people, they fail the test. People always suppose that when I interact with them that I must be somehow either hostile or at least passive-aggressive, or that I must be sort of poisoning the discussion. No, it's a lot worse than that. I'm always polite. I'm always respectful. I always assume that I'm wrong and they're right. And every time I have a discussion with these evil cultists from the Ayn Rand Institute who are going forth and ruining the life of every single young person they can have. They want to brainwash you and blacken your soul. Every time I have a discussion with these people, it always goes wrong. I approach them in 1,000 different ways, 1,000 different techniques. I'm always benevolent, but I'm always listening, which is their problem, because they can't stand up to scrutiny. So I'd love to debate them on any issue whatsoever, and then I'd be more than happy to ruin their lives, to destroy them personally and philosophically. But these are bad people. I don't think you realize this, because you self-censor, and all sorts of other people that are polite and well-educated self-censor. I think that your lifestyle is interesting, Gennady. I think you're a wonderful person on many levels.
Thank you.
One thing you do which is interesting is you sort of like it's almost like you wear your respectability and your politeness as a coat of armor, which I don't do that for all kinds of reasons. And believe it or not, I can explain it. You probably think that the way I write and conduct myself is random. You'd be shocked. I'm amazingly well thought out, and that's why I dare and defy you and every person on the planet to question me as close as possible, because I can meet all of those challenges as far as I can tell. And if I can't meet those challenges, then too bad for me, but also good for me, because then I will learn where my failures are and weaknesses, and I always feel as if I can improve. So my goal is always to be the strongest liberal thinker on the planet. If you read my book, and again, I'm sorry to pontificate, but if you read my book, Pure Liberal Fire, you will find that even though I embrace a simple philosophy, which is just reason, individualism, and freedom, it's more complicated than that. You will find that I can analyze the current issues of the day and the historical issues philosophically and culturally much better than you imagine, and anyone can. There's much more to say. So I hold up even like the three cutting-edge intellectual movements of today, which are Austrian Economics, Libertarian Politics, and Objectivist Philosophy. If you analyze them from the sort of childish and simple viewpoint of pure liberalism, you can go amazingly far. And I do that, or at least I think I do that, over and over in my book. So it's a kind of a hit and miss book. I wouldn't say it's all that profound, because it consists of mini essays. So the essays are between 300 and 400 words on average. I'm brave enough and crazy enough to try and discuss philosophy in a mini essay. And my next book will feature longer essays, of course. But I think that pure liberalism is a direction mankind has been going for 2,600 years. I think I'm the first pure liberal on the planet, however arrogant that sounds.
So, well, first of all, I'll offer a few comments about your own book and the Ayn Rand Institute.
I know. Yeah, I know I'm sort of pontificating, so you can address anything you wish.
So my personal experience with your own book has been very limited. I met him once at a 2008 conference, APEE, Association of Private Enterprise Educators, I believe, which was an economic philosophical conference, and he and I had a few conversations. He seemed to be, yes, quite a bit on the doctrinaire side, very intense and to a certain extent quite rude to people he disagreed with.
Yes.
I was taking notes on one of his lectures. I was one of the more technically advanced people in the room, so at the time I brought my own laptop, hooked it up, typed up my notes, and he apparently did not have a prepared version of this speech. So he asked me, since I was taking notes, could I email him the notes afterward? And I thought, okay, why not? So I emailed him the notes afterward, and no response, not even a thank you. So I would have thought he would have appreciated the fact that I had done some work that helped him. And
they're rude. They're always rude. They're malicious too, as human beings. Believe it or not, you just have to study them and genuinely and truly speak to them. I think one advantage I have because I'm such a daring radical about everything is I actually have a better understanding of people who are black, people who are homeless, people who are Muslims, people who are objectivist cultists, because all of these groups I speak to, and I always speak to them respectfully and politely, but I also sort of, you might say, betray them, if you want to think of it that way, in the sense that I listen and I think. And so I have a better understanding of all these people. I'm never passive-aggressive, but I never self-censor. So I think that's a difficult art to achieve. And I've had so many, like I said, I've had so many bad experiences with Leonard Peikoff and Yaron Brook and even Don Watkins. I can tell you, maybe I had a decently sustained conversation with Don Watkins, who wrote a great book about Social Security, a great book historically. And so I said all kinds of things, and it ended up being hostile as usual. I'm hostile to everyone, but if someone wants to be hostile to me, that's too bad for them, because I can always return it in far larger measures than they can generate it toward me. I hate them more than they hate me. But in the end, the final discussion with Don Watkins, who did write a great book about Social Security, is I said, well, now, are you saying that if you and I have a debate that the Ayn Rand Institute is fundamentally an occultist and religious organization, you would not participate? And he said something rather like, the question is illegitimate. He would never participate in a discussion of that time. And he wrote me off in a kind of a personal and intellectual way in so many different ways. So I've had, like I said, maybe I'm not being very articulate, but I've had an infinite variety of bad experiences with these guys, and I've never found a single one which is good, and that's very notable. In the game of life, if you find one exception to something, that's important. But if you find zero, that's notable. Like, I don't want to, again, I'm not trying to pontificate, but I find that very easy to do. I once read a novel by a left-winger, I forgot what his name was, a New York Jewish leftist, and I come from New York. And maybe his name was Saul Bellow, it doesn't matter, but I remember being shocked by the fact that every single sentence was bad. There was not one sentence which was worthwhile in the whole book. And I thought I had to be wrong about this, but then finally, after a long time, after perhaps a lot of lack of intelligence on my part, it finally dawned on me. This is a guy who's deliberately writing a bad novel, at least in some sense. Maybe it's taking place subconsciously, but it's very important to note that every single sentence is wrong. And so when you meet up with these cult objectivists and you can't have a normal discussion with them, that's notable. If something goes wrong every single time, it's notable. When I speak to the regular objectivists, I always have good results. I mean, or at least there's only a few exceptions. So that's a quick insight, which is, perhaps off topic, but I'm happy to make it to someone as highly intelligent and as well educated as you are about liberalism.
Well, I definitely appreciate hearing your impressions, and I do think there's an important distinction to make between the people who think in this cultish, dogmatic fashion and the people who are open to truth and reason and critically evaluating their own thinking as well as the thinking of others. Ultimately, the truth has to be valued above what one currently thinks, because what one currently thinks may be right, it may be wrong, but putting it to the test critically, a rational thinker who seeks intellectual growth and intellectual challenge. Now, speaking of challenge, I wanted to raise an area of disagreement
Okay.
between us, and this is from my review of Pure Liberal Fire, as well as a response that you wrote to it. So my
Okay.
comment was, Zantonavitch's approach and style would entail achieving a fiery, dramatic, immediate deposition of everything, every
Yes.
person, every policy, every idea he considers evil, dangerous, or damaging. My
Yes.
view of reform is more surgical, focused on getting the sequence of steps right, so as to minimize the damage inflicted during the transition, while ridding the world of the disease of bad policies, and in a more long-term fashion, through persuasion and free market education, also ridding it of bad thinking of the sort that motivates bad policies. Now, you responded to that, and you had a very articulate and extensive comment. This is just an excerpt from that. You said, "We do indeed differ here. I don't worry about the
Yep.
transition at all. I figure mankind needs the pure truth first, last, most, always, and very clearly and loudly. They don't need to be spoon-fed. They can handle the truth and will process it correctly and in the correct order." And, I wanted your thoughts on that, but first I'll make a comment. It seems to me, though, there are so many people who are partially rational or perhaps receptive to some aspects of what one might have to say, but reflexively hostile when it comes to others. And to achieve meaningful change, wouldn't it be necessary to figure out a way to harness what is the best in them and channel that toward improvement in their thinking without putting them off in some way? Do you see the point I'm trying to make?
Well, I might see it. I think I see it. I have two responses to that. First off, in some sense, because I am a radical, and also I've lately learned to categorize myself as a misanthrope, a hater of mankind. And I also think I'm living on the planet of the apes, which by the way, I don't enjoy. But for all of that, I would say that even though I have an immense contempt and disgust and revulsion toward the man in the street, toward the average man, I think that at some point I actually have more respect for him than you do, and maybe anyone else on the planet. It's a kind of a tiny microscopic respect, but it's real. And I think that perhaps you're trying to either be generous to him, or maybe even you're deceiving yourself into thinking that the mass man has more respect for logic than he does. I think his respect for it is very tiny, but I also think it's real. And with all due respect to you and everyone else, I don't think you understand that it is real. So if I can tell the truth, then that's all that's necessary. It's my job to try and tell the truth. It's a very difficult job. I always challenge myself to the limit I can. That's a normal way to live your life. The best life is the most challenging, the one where you work the hardest. If you do work the hardest and you work in the most difficult areas, you're going to make mistakes. And I make a lot of mistakes. It doesn't crush me psychologically. I think perhaps I have more strength than anyone in that. I'm not afraid to make mistakes. But I mean, the man in the street does listen to reason, even if he sort of seems like he doesn't at all. And even if it seems like his spirit is like that of an insect. I think that the man in the street, or the average guy, really is like he's a repulsive, reptilian, disgusting thing. But he has hints of goodness. Even Nietzsche pointed out that the man in the street has a kind of spirituality. So that's part of my answer to you. I think the man in the street can hear the truth. He doesn't have to have it spoon-fed. And the second answer to you is that I think that intellectuals rule the world, and I think that the mass man, to use the term of Albert J. Nock, which I like, I think that the mass man, he's a kind of a sheep, or almost even an intellectual and spiritual slave. So the fate of the world is determined by people like you and I, and whatever you and I decide, the mass man will follow along in a completely passive and docile manner, or at least in effect in a completely passive and docile manner. So I think it's all about the debate between the Objectivists and the Libertarians and the Austrians, and between yourself and myself. I think you and I will decide the fate of the world. The man in the 99% of all people, or 95%, they'll have no say. They'll trust you and I to make the correct decision. So far, you and I made the bad decision. We're sort of on the side of Kant and not enough on the side of Rand. We're sort of on the side of Karl Marx and not enough on the side of Adam Smith. So those are my two quick answers. I hope you understood. It's very possible, of course, I'm not so rhetorically adept.
Well, I think you've definitely communicated your point very clearly. Now, my response is I would love to be influencing the course of the world and the course of human history and progress. I think
you are.
that would be. Well, I appreciate that. I hope my book, Death is Wrong, has had some effect, especially on the next generation that will come up and be exposed to these ideas without having the age-old rationalizations for death and human mortality essentially indoctrinated into them before they start to see any alternatives. So
I think that there's one way to look at it, which is to say that I'm a partisan of the great ideas theory of history and progress, but also to a certain extent of the great man theory of history and progress. I think that ideas dominate, but every now and then great men will influence us in the direction of goodness or badness. Like in the most recent period, we moved in the direction of liberalism because of the genuinely great people of Ronald Reagan, who was a liberal, not a right-wing conservative or a left-winger, and Margaret Thatcher, who was a right-winger, who was a liberal, not a right-winger or a left-winger, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a liberal, not a right-winger or a left-winger, and Deng Xiaoping, which was a liberal and not a right-winger or a left-winger. And I've immediately lost my train of thought. But I think that, oh yes, perhaps I have it back. I certainly think that persuasion is important, but I focus most of my effort on learning the truth if I can, and then much less on trying to persuade people. I do think that persuasion is possible because in the battle between good and evil, the forces of evil, almost by definition, will exert energy and passion, and therefore as a good guy you have to exert counter energy and passion, and it is worthwhile to persuade people to a certain extent, but you and I differ in that, and I think it's only a fairly minor issue. The most important thing is to try and determine the truth, and then once I determine the truth, then maybe perhaps people that are more friendly to their fellow man, such as yourself, or college professors, or people that write editorials in newspapers and magazines. Those guys will persuade them of my point of view, my pure liberal point of view, if my viewpoint is true and virtuous, which I think it is. And I expend all my effort trying to make my viewpoint true and correct and insightful and learn as much as possible. But I do think that intellectuals rule the world. So I have more confidence in intellectuals than you do. And I have more confidence.
Perhaps you do.
And I have and in a different way, I have more confidence in the mass man than you do. I say that with all due respect. I can see how you wouldn't want to be quite so misanthropic as myself. That's a personal choice, and of course, it costs me in a lot of respects, and it still costs me but I have a hard time getting along with my fellow man, and you know, I like men for their intellectual discussions, and I like women for their sexual activity. But I think that in general, I have a low opinion of my fellow man, which I do express because it seems like it's injustice and fraud for me not to. I think, just to put it very quickly, and again, I'm skipping over everything rapidly, I think that everyone in the world is a liar, but not me. Everyone in the world is a hypocrite, but not me. Everyone in the world is a lowlife, but not me. So, and I choose to live like that.
Well, there's quite a bit here I disagree with. I think
I'm
both
sure.
men and women have the same potential for intellectualism and for rational thinking. I mean, we've been spending this conversation talking about Ayn Rand, who for all her failings was a brilliant mind and a great philosopher. And
she's an exception. I mean, like 95% of the intellectuals are males. That's very striking.
Well, yes, to at least historically speaking, but that is changing, I think, and I do think there is still a problem with that regard, in that there is a kind of anti-intellectual expectation that is made of many women in contemporary culture. Like, a lot of women are discouraged from applying their rational minds, and I've met a lot of highly intelligent women who are good thinkers, who are very competent and capable, but for some reason they felt deterred from that. And they felt, I would consider some of them to be great, excellent thinkers. They were deterred from that, though, by the perhaps unspoken expectation that it is not a woman's place in life to behave that way. And for someone like me, who is a transhumanist who believes in lifting the limitations on the human condition, it is so important to embrace any rational mind that comes along, no matter how they're physically instantiated, male, female, neuter, heterosexual, homosexual, transgender, a space alien. You've mentioned.
Yes, I like them all. I like them all.
Or artificial intelligence. If human beings can develop sentient, autonomous AI, all of those would be important minds. And in my view, we need as many allies as we can get. And ultimately, that's what I'm trying to do. I do want a more rational world. I see the world as being tremendously flawed right now. There are bad policies. There are many evil people in the world. See ISIS in Iraq right now. See the militants who are fighting in Ukraine right now.
I think all the evils in the world can be described by just one word, which is illiberal, and all the progress in the world can be described by just one word, which is liberal.
So my position, and I think I can generally agree with your characterization there, my position is you can find liberal strains and liberal-minded people everywhere you look, and in some places they're more of a minority than in others, but you need to take your allies where you can get them, because ultimately, unfortunately, even though reason has been a dominant strain in Western philosophy, the majority of people are not philosophically inclined in that way. They may implicitly absorb certain ideas, certain presuppositions that intellectuals would convey, but often in a very indirect manner and mediated through a lot of very concrete cultural instantiations. Like a lot of people understand particular rituals or traditions or concrete objects, and they have a certain significance to those people, and through those objects you can communicate certain values, certain abstract principles. But it takes many ways and it takes many approaches to get across.
Well, I agree with that.
And in some ways, what I find valuable about a lot of human beings, even those who aren't intellectuals, is the pursuit for the betterment of life. I mean,
with all due respect, I think it's good that there are people like you, which are a different type than people like me, and I think you and I both have our separate jobs, but we should do whatever it is that we are, so to speak, born to, or whatever is part of our nature, or whatever is part of the way we were brought up. So you're going to work a certain side of the street, and I'm going to work maybe the other side of the street, and you and I are allies, and we should each sort of go. I think there's a wide variety of people, and we should exploit them exactly as you said, and all different kinds of people can contribute. So I seem to be on the side of quiet but absolutely ferocious and terrifying radicalism.
Quiet but absolutely ferocious and terrifying. Well,
that's the impression I get from other people. Yeah. I mean, I seem like a normal person to me, and I even would say I'm like the first normal human being in the history of man. So I'm just a normal liberal who thinks things in a normal way and tries to find the truth. And everybody else has some sort of secret problem and secret agenda. And by the way, you said that in some sense that you don't like my direct approach or my sort of all-at-once approach. I haven't told anyone this, and I'm not going to tell you, but I can do worse, and shortly I will do worse.
Well, here's what all right. Well, I'll certainly be interested to see what you come up with next, but what my thinking is simply the problems of the world are huge right now, and the best minds of human history have been grappling with them for millennia. Right now we seem to be standing on the cusp of some truly radical solutions to age-old predicaments of the human condition. But I individually, for all of the commendable praise that you've imparted upon me, for which I thank you, I still perceive myself as a human being to be limited in my sole abilities to accomplish that change.
Well, and we're all limited, but the good news, by the way, which perhaps I did not get across, is that in the last 30 years the world has been experiencing a renaissance. So my simple view of history which is not in the book, but it will be in the next book, is that basically the world rose up to maybe a kind of height in the late 1700s. That's the most liberal period in human history. Then we fell down from 1785 to 1985. And then over the last 30 years, we've been in a kind of a renaissance. So if you want to ask yourself, well, what is the philosophy of Eastern Europe or Russia or China or India? Well, they're not embracing right-wing conservatism nor left-wing progressivism. They're quietly embracing up-wing liberalism. So there's a lot of hope in the world right now, at least in general. And also it's worth noting that the world progresses in a way which is very slow and gradual. And it's not hard. It's very difficult to change directions. I think the world is like a giant ocean liner. It's very hard to start it or stop it or turn it. Once it starts going in a certain direction, that's the direction it's going to go in for a while. And the good news is, for the last 30 years, we've been going in the rational, liberal direction. But if you want to understand that in, hopefully, great detail and better than any other thinker on the planet, then you should read my book, which is Pure Liberal Fire. And it's about $12 in print. You can receive it in less than a week. And it's about $3 in ebook, and you can receive it in less than 5 minutes.
So, yes, I definitely think people should read Pure Liberal Fire. I recommend it as a challenging read, as a book that will make people think, and as a book that will make people cognizant of some of these broad trends that
But you also have
about.
to be part of the intellectual and moral elite. It's not for a normal person. I've sold the book to normal people by hand, you might say, including even what I consider to be genuinely good people. But I recently sold it to what I thought was a wonderful woman who was a Muslim, a hardline Muslim. We had great discussions, but it seems like in the end she read my book and it broke her heart. It crushed her spirit. So I don't want that to happen.
Right.
It's
definitely, I agree with you. It's definitely not for everyone. I did want to...
It's not for the masses.
Right. I did want to point out, though, and I think this is a key area, a key insight. Among the allies that we would need to realize a transformation of the world for the better, we would need to have a lot of the people whom you would consider as the masses. And each one of them is an individual. And I think I really like a phrase that you use in many of your writings, the holy individual, because
Yes.
I think it's kind of perplexing to me, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, that on the one hand you consider yourself to be a misanthrope, and on the other hand you use a phrase like the holy individual, with which I actually have great sympathy. That is, the individual embodies essentially all that is valuable, and a society is nothing but a collection of individuals who interact with one another.
I can give you a partial answer to that, which is I think that as much as I'm a misanthrope and I hate and revile my fellow man, and I think he has treated me very, very poorly in a way which I did not deserve, as much as I'm openly hostile, based on reading a countless number of thinkers, I think that secretly you and every other person are hostile too. It's just you won't admit it. And because you won't admit it, you secretly also have less respect. My respect for the mass man is very tiny, but it does exist. And it's like that quote from Nietzsche. Not only do I think the mass man has some mind in his monkey, reptilian, disgusting brain, not only do I think he has some mind and some common sense, I think he has some nobility and spirituality. It's very tiny, but it exists. And I think it's sort of, I can speak directly to these people, to the mass men, and it seems like they hear me and understand me. They certainly only maybe gather a general impression of what I'm saying, but that's enough. They overall get it, and at some point yourself and everyone else is patronizing. You're insulting them because you should treat them rougher. They like it when you insult them and tell them that they're morons and lowlifes. They like it.
Well, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree here, because that hasn't been my experience. My experience is
That's correct.
Persuasion is very difficult because people have their justifications in their minds for what they believe, and sometimes those justifications are shaped by a lifetime of experiences, of reading if they're into that, or of communicating with others who are of a similar mind. And no matter how effective I am, no matter how rational I am or how persuasive I am, I can't change that in a day. And really to establish a rapport with a person to the point where that person is receptive to what I have to say.
But I think it's maybe your job to speak to the mass man, and it's not my job. And I actually even made a mistake in terms of the way I wrote. Like, I've been a serious writer. I told you I sort of dropped out intellectually for like 18 years, and that's a, you know, a devastating personal comment on me intellectually. But I've been a serious writer ever since my city was attacked in 2011. New York City was attacked by the Muslims, by the jihadis. So I've been a serious writer for about 14 years to whatever good or bad or I've achieved, whatever strength or weakness. But and again, I seem to have I've lost my point. But I simply think that maybe I know, which is it's your job to appeal to the mass man, and you will always be more popular than I am, and that's good, because I have no desire to win over the mass man on the sort of level that you do or a college professor does. My goal is to influence you, and then your goal is to influence the masses, and so we should each do our respective jobs.
All right. Well, fair enough on that point. One last topic of conversation.
I know that sounds arrogant. I apologize if that sounds arrogant, because it may well be that you're smarter than I am. I certainly think you have a higher IQ than I am, and you may well be smarter in all kinds of ways. Well, in maybe even every way, but nevertheless, it's my job sort of to be a quiet firebrand, and that's why I put the name Fire in my book, because people say I'm fiery. I'm not conscious of that myself, except in a limited fashion, because I do write in a stylized way based on many people, based on, believe it or not, comedians over and over. I'm influenced by people like Kurt Vonnegut and Saturday Night Live and the Harvard Lampoon and the National Lampoon and Mad Magazine and George Carlin. But,
definitely a lot of George Carlin, his influence I can see in your writing.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
By the way, a great man who we unfortunately lost recently, but I do.
That's a tragedy and a nightmare that we lost him to death. So that's why I'm glad you're working so hard on transhumanism. Perhaps I will become much more of a transhumanist in a few years, but I seem to have some sort of intellectual job to do in the next 4 or 5 years. Then maybe I can switch over to transhumanism. But also, I want to contact those aliens, and I want those aliens to contact me, and I'm very resentful of them. Not only do I hate mankind, I hate the space aliens because they haven't contacted me. So
why do you think if there is other intelligent life in the universe, and there is a good probabilistic argument to be made for that, what do you think is the primary reason why humans haven't been contacted? And I'll share with you a brief thought.
I'll tell you why. It's an easy answer. It's because you and I are animals. We're very disgusting creatures. They have no desire to contact a low, filthy animal like mankind. People today believe in God, which is absurd. They believe in self-sacrifice, which is absurd. They believe in welfare statism, which is absurd. In essence, human beings today are cannibals. We eat our young. They have nothing to say to us. What would they say to us if they come down here? Are they going to fix us completely? That's not their job. You sort of have to take a look at the prime directive from Star Trek. They're going to leave us alone until we become worthy creatures. We're very unworthy. But the point is, right now, as far as I can tell, I am a worthy creature. So they should speak to me. They should rescue me. They should take me away from this hell. I've written short stories about this in which I invented one guy the year 700 in Italy who lived a great life philosophically, and then in the end he was rescued by a space alien, and he left very quickly and easily, and he was happy to leave behind mankind. So I'm very resentful of space aliens, of ET, that they do not contact me. And I want them to contact me. I'm the most worthy. I don't want them to contact the President of the United States or the General Secretary of the UN. They should contact the person, the human being of the most merit, and that's me.
Well, my own thinking on this, surprising similarities to some aspects of your own. I think if other intelligent life forms exist and they know of human beings, though there are vast distances between star systems, and it's not clear whether any civilization would, for a long, long time, hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, discover, say, a mode of faster-than-light travel. But if they had, I do think they have some sort of prime directive in place, and human beings in their minds are not ready yet.
Well, I think they're here right now. I don't think they are limited by the speed of light, and I think that they're here right now. They're studying us to the extent that we're interesting, but they're studying us to the extent that you and I are studying the mushrooms in China, which is not very much. So they're looking at us like zoo animals, and they're studying us in a kind of an anthropological way. And in certain respects, by the way, I consider myself not a philosopher, but an anthropologist. So I'm studying primitive human beings, the ones that live in the 21st century, and which are very lowly and unimpressive. But I mean, I think the space aliens could easily be the size of an atom, or even much smaller. I think they have the ability to have a very high intelligence of maybe an IQ of 300, or maybe an IQ of 1,000, in which case they experience reality in a completely different way than you and I, just as you and I experience reality different from an ant, basically. So I think they could be here, and they could even be darting about faster than the speed of light and the size of what are those things called? Well, I forget some sort of quark, or what are those things that travel through the Earth? Neutrinos. Okay, I think they could be the size of neutrinos, and they might all. And I don't necessarily think they use electromagnetic radiation to communicate. So we're searching for them, looking via our TV signals and radio signals, but they might be using a different technique. And even if they are using a special form of extremely high energy radiation to communicate, I think it would be incredibly simple to shield us from that knowledge. They would have an unbelievably easy time. In 1,000 different ways they could create some sort of a cloaking device to hide themselves. But I think they're here. I think they're here to the extent that they care, and I think they're aware of us, but they find us, they're not going to contact us because they're not going to contact dolphins, or they're not going to contact guinea pigs, and they're not going to contact bees or mosquitoes or ants.
So my thought is, during our lifetimes, humankind needs to progress to the point where I think at least the vast majority of human beings would be morally worthy, would adopt an enlightened, rational view of life, would detest the prospect of inflicting violence upon innocent life forms, would detest the prospect of brutality or wanton destruction, and then if there are intelligent life forms, they would perhaps find us more worthy companions. Now, obviously, for me, the jury is out on that question. I really don't know, but I think it's a distinct possibility.
Yes, I think it's a likelihood. I sort of I see that this is a very rich discussion, and all I can say is I hope I answered your questions intelligently and directly. Maybe if we can close, because I sort of have to run to work at my very primitive job. Can you ask me?
Yes.
Can you ask me maybe one or two questions which are hard? I want to be challenged, because bear in mind that I've said countless number of things here which are very arrogant and offensive to people. So if I'm the strongest liberal thinker on the planet, if I'm the only liberal in mankind, I should be challenged relentlessly and mercilessly by you and everyone else. And you should prove that you're smarter and better than me by asking me a question I cannot answer. So let's hear one or two really, really hard ones.
Okay, hard question. Why would you want, say, people who disagree with you, like people from the Ayn Rand Institute, to come to harm instead of wanting to persuade them and see a situation where they actually change their minds and begin to think more rationally? Wouldn't that be a better outcome from an enlightened perspective, from a morally higher plane than you think they operate on?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by having them come to harm. Certainly, aesthetically, that sounds good. I want them to come to harm, but they haven't actually committed any crime, just as Jesus has not and Kant has not. I think the way you defeat people intellectually is you refute their ideas. So unless they actually engage in the initiation of force, what you should do is hate them and wish them ill and hope they fall down a well and drowned. Which is not necessarily the case what I want for someone like Leonard Peikoff or Yaron Brook or Peter Schwartz or Harry Binswanger. I would rather have a debate with them, and then I would be more than happy, as I said, to crush them, to defeat them intellectually and personally. They don't have my spirit, they don't have my indomitable spirit, and they can't match up with me intellectually. So they're afraid of me always, and when I find them, I will hurt them, and I will be glad to do it.
Hurt them intellectually through
Yes.
making a devastating argument. Okay, I just wanted to get that across very clearly, because
Right.
as people of a libertarian persuasion, and as you would consider yourself an objectivist, I would characterize myself as an objectivist in a broad sense. We do not like the initiation of force against people who haven't initiated it themselves.
Right,
So,
even really terribly evil people like Jesus and Marx and Kant. You can't. You're not allowed to physically attack them. You're allowed to intellectually destroy them.
yes, I'm glad we brought that up. Now, one last question for
Sure.
you, and I think this is a really tough one because I don't have a complete answer to it
Let's hear it.
either. What do you do about the brutality that goes on in the world now, say with ISIS in Iraq or with the civil war in Ukraine, and how do you solve it without harming a single innocent person? Because
Right.
if we have the holy individual, then anybody in those areas who is innocent, who is decent, who has a spark of goodness and doesn't initiate aggression, does not deserve to be harmed.
Well, I have an answer to that, and I have an answer to 10 or 20 other questions which you're capable of posing, and maybe we can discuss it next time.
Sure.
But that's a serious intellectual question, and as usual, I feel as if I'm in competition with yourself, with the Ayn Rand Institute, with the Atlas Society, with all the best thinkers, which are all liberals, and which are basically all objectivists. So my quick foreign policy answer to that is that America, or at least private people, they need to go forth and propagandize the hell out of the world. I think the Germans were correct, and the Nazi Germans were correct, and even the communist Russians were correct about the value of propaganda. We need to use radio and TV and internet, and if these guys decide to somehow, and I'm getting a bit of feedback here, but if these guys somehow decide to block our signals, then we should bomb them. But we should basically attack ISIS by through propaganda, through telling the truth, and through relentless propaganda, which always tells the truth. But it's got to be the truth on a high level, which only you and I know, which is pure liberalism. And then, of course, our policy we should kill the leaders of the military and the police and the government and the religion and the party. So maybe like the top 10 or top 100, and we should send in special troops. And we should demand that they convert to freedom in the same way that America did that for Germany and Japan in 1945. That's a quick answer. So I'm skipping over a lot of stuff. So I'll let you sum up, and I really, really enjoyed this interview. But let's hear how you sum it up.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts. A very intense, provocative, I would say fiery discussion, and in my view, not just a cool fire, but perhaps a raging fire.
And I can do worse.
Yes, I believe you,
not.
actually.
I don't know if you believe me, but it's true.
I believe you. And there's a lot more that could be said. There's a lot more that could be explored. I understand we're out of time. So I'll leave it at that. There are many issues where we agree to disagree, but let's see how the future turns out. And let's see how the course of human affairs in the next few decades leads humankind to progress or not. I definitely hope my vision is realized, and a lot of this true liberalism that you articulate is a part of my vision, but let's see which approach ultimately ends up bearing more fruit. So with that, I think we'll conclude, and I enjoyed the stimulating discussion. I hope you have
So did I.
a great rest of the day.
Okay, thank you. Very nice to speak to you. Good night.